Hey there, everybody. So Opal is just about just about asleep over there. So hopefully I won't keep her up. She's super cute right now. So we are going to be reading some more of The Legend of Huma. After I get my camera to sit in the right spot. There we go. Boron turned to gaze at the nymph. He was a rough-featured man, neither handsome nor ugly, but weathered. A deep sadness was in his eyes. Oddly, he was also minus the impressive mustache that most knights sported. Instead, he wore a black beard clipped in the same style as Lord Avondale. Huma wondered how long the other Solamnic knight had lived in this region. "Leave us now," Boron said to the nymph. "Will you not fight?" Boron seemed disgusted by the question. "He is one of my comrades. I will not fight him." "Oh." She frowned, then brightened. "Will you fight the mage?" "Mage?" The other knight brushed an errant lock of hair from his face and looked at the slumbering bundle. He must be sorely tired to sleep through all of this. "She's put him under," Huma explained. A sigh. The knight seemed to expect this. "Why?" The nymph pouted. "I do not like him. He's one of the dreamers I showed you." "Is he now?" Boron straightened, his interest keenly awakened. "Which one?" "The one who keeps dying." Huma's eyes narrowed. At one point in their travels, Magius had revealed that his death scene now repeated itself constantly in his dreams. The nymph could not have known that. Or could she? Did she really see others' dreams? "Release him," the rider ordered. "Do you not want to sit with me?" She shifted all too purposefully. Boron's face reddened again. No, leave us. This is important." The water creature put two delicate hands on her hips and gave an angry look. "I do not like you anymore. I no longer want you to come and visit me." She ran off into the water and, when it proved deep enough, dove beneath the surface. There was nothing to indicate that she was anything but human, save for the slight greenish cast to her skin and the amazing fluidity of her movements. Opal wakes up, sleepily shakes, and just kind of tired waddles over to the kitchen for a glass of water before, I think, going to the bedroom. Huma wondered how she breathed. Boron muttered, "She does not mean what she said. She's been angry with me more than a dozen times before, and each time she forgets before I've drawn another breath. I believe it's in the nature of their kind, although I've never seen another." Huma looked down at the still slumbering Magius. She remembered to release her victim? Give her a few moments. She can hold on to the spell for only a brief time longer. "You know my name, brother of the Order. What might yours be?" Huma straightened. "I am Huma, Knight of the Crown, out of Vingard Keep." "Vingard!" The name was spoken as if the name of Paladin himself. "Have they broken through at last? Is the war finally coming to a close?" Huma shook his head and then stared at the ground. Quickly, he described what had happened. Boron was not pleased. Sorry. "One of her games," Boron said with a gesture towards the water, "is to take the Dreamer's Mirror, an ancient artifact, shake it, and see whose dreams she gets." The bearded knight shivered. "The dreams of the Dragon Queen's servants are darker than you could ever imagine." "Has she always lived here?" Boron shrugged. He did not like speaking about the nymph. His relationship, no matter what it was something the knighthood would not condone. "She was here when I joined the outpost. Her treasures are incredibly ancient." He paused. "I came upon her by accident. The other knights never come this far. I was chasing a stag, and I had no desire to lose it. It's not often that we eat such splendid fare at the outpost. For one reason or another, the stag rushed through here. I fell and my steed came to an abrupt halt, and when I finally cleared the pain from my head, I found myself looking into her eyes." Huma could read the embarrassment on the other knight's features. You have no need to fear, brother of the Order. I will tell no one of this lake. Boron shrugged. They know, more or less. I've made no secret of my comings and goings. I have done little more than sit with her. A nymph is not real. I would want something more. Magus began to stir. The other knight pointed at him. Your sorcerer's friend wakes. I doubt he will take kindly to having been kept under a glamour spell all this time. Huma stared down, or glanced down. Magus was not yet truly awake, but any decision on Huma's part would have to be swift. He need not know. Huma, excuse me. The bearded knight said nothing, but gratitude flared in his eyes. It was obvious to Huma that he cared more about the water nymph than he had indicated. Magus leapt up as some sense told him that he and Huma were no longer alone. He turned to stare at the newcomer. Greetings, Red Robe. Boron's salutation was crisp and functional. Magus received only the respect due of one who traveled with a fellow knight. The mage had recovered. He bowed low in the manner so typical of him and returned the greeting. My greetings to you, Knight of Solamnia. I had no idea another of the noble knighthood was so far south. Huma's expression did not change, but he was disturbed by yet another lie from his friend. When they had fled from the ruins, Magius had commented on his desire to bypass the outpost. We have an outpost down here, Boron replied. A small one and often forgotten. I do not doubt it will be abandoned as the years pass. Yes, the magic user was clearly uninterested. It was visibly uninterested. Instead, he was staring down at the spot where he had been sleeping, and then at the lake. My apologies for not rising sooner. It is unlike me. I did not mean to be impolite. Boron fidgeted, and his horse, a cream-colored charger, stepped nervously about as it felt the shifting of its rider. Not at all. It happens often here. I myself have fallen into the very same sort of sleep. Still, it is no excuse. How far is it to the outpost? Huma finally asked, causing Magus to glare at him. Not far, an hour's ride. You must come, of course. Despite the terrible news you bring, your presence would be appreciated. Magus chuckled enigmatically. The other knight was taking a distinct dislike to the spellcaster. Pretending not to have heard the mage's laugh, Boron indicated the duo's mounts. These beasts appeared to have ridden all night. They need some proper care if you plan to move on. He was careful not to ask the purpose of their journey, assuming that Huma would inform him if and when it was proper. The mage gave in. Very well. It shall have to be a short stop, though. We have far to travel. That was all that Boron would say in reply, but he watched both men with interest. Huma noted as they untied their animals and mounted them. When they were ready, he pointed to the west. That way. Ride on ahead. I'll be only a moment. Huma and Magus urged their steeds through the trees and brush. The former glanced back and saw Boron dismount and remove a small wooden carving from one of his saddlebags. The water nearby began to bubble, and the head of the nymph broke the surface. Then Huma's view was cut off by the trees. When his companion turned to him, the knight reacted as if his thoughts had been on the trail ahead. It was not more than a minute or two before Boron came riding up behind them. He nodded to Huma and immediately took the lead. As they rode, Huma plied him with questions about the outpost. Are there many outposts here? We are one of only two. The other lies on the western side of that stretch of mountains. Boron pointed to a chain of peaks that became visible only when the trail of riders emerged onto the top of a hill. Essentially, we oversee the eastern half and they the west. There's little down here to interest the Dragon Queen, though. We have been reduced to chasing would-be brigands when we should be charging into the lines of foul ogres. Are you a large outpost? I did not know there was anyone out there. Boron laughed bitterly, it seemed. Neither did I, until I was ordered down here some 5 years ago. No, we're not a large outpost. 80 knights trying to keep watch on a countryside rivaling the size of Solamnia. We had more once. Huma did not need elaboration. Now, with the war going so badly, they truly were cut off from all others, save their counterparts on the western side of the mountains. They could not abandon their outposts and go riding north to join the struggle. They had been ordered down here, and they would stay until that order was changed. Duty was something ingrained into every knight. Renard had expressed the importance of that time and time again. "Have you ever been to the mountains?" Magus asked abruptly. "No." Boron had no desire to converse with the spellcaster. "Has anyone?" "Only to the outer peaks. We stay away from the inner range." Magus appeared quite interested. "Why is that?" "The paths are unsafe, that's all." Huma watched his companion's face fall. Magus was probing for something more out of the ordinary. This deep into southern Argoth, it was difficult to believe a war raged in the land. To be sure, the skies were as overcast as they had been in the north, but there was more of a peace in the woods and fields. It was a false peace, Huma realized, for it would vanish the instant the Dragon Queen's hordes were finished with Solamnia. With Solamnia gone, the Queen of Darkness would sweep over the rest of the continent in less than a year. "We're almost here." Huma took his first look at the Solamnic outpost. It was not a towering edifice like Vingard Keep. The entire structure was made of wood, treated so that flames would not turn it into a death trap. The walls surrounding the complex appeared to be more than 4 times Huma's height. The top edge was consistently punctuated by gaps set aside for archers. Only one building was visible over the wall, a watchtower upon which even now a sentry was standing, his attention fixed to the approaching trio. The man raised a shout and pointed towards them. Boron did not call out, but he gave the sentry a weary wave. Huma glanced at Magus. The mage was staring longingly at the distant mountains. There were renewed cries when the sentry noticed that one of the 2 strangers was a fellow knight. The wooden gates swung open as the three neared them, and it appeared that nearly all of the outpost's inhabitants were coming out to welcome the newcomers. "Boron, back so soon? What have you brought with you?" The tall, elderly speaker must have been a knight even when Lord Oswald was a child. He was very deeply wrinkled, and his voice shook slightly, but his moves were graceful, and Huma suspected he could still handle a sword. Unlike the majority of the knights, who seemed to favor Argothian beards, the aged knight still sported a traditional, if somewhat silver, mustache. He was a Knight of the Rose, the only one Huma could see upon first inspection. "Hail, Lord Taggin. 2 travelers in need of rest, one of them a brother to our ranks. He has news of the utmost importance." Taggin nodded grimly. "I thought as much." To the rest of the assembled knights he said, "Return to your duties. Remember that you are Knights of Solamnia, not a gaggle of hungry geese." Not gaggle of hungry gooses." Some disappointment showed in the faces of the knights, many of whom, Boron explained, had been assigned to the outpost for nearly 10 years. Taggin had been there twice as long. In fact, he had manned the outpost by himself for many years. Huma could not help smiling. Somehow he felt that he was among a different breed of knights than those back at Vingard Keep. They were less strict with the rules, more willing to bend to the circumstances. As it turned out, the outpost included only 3 buildings. One was the tower, which also served as armory and a stable. The second was a type of longhouse which Huma recognized as the living quarters of the company. The third, and surprisingly enough the most insignificant looking of the 3, was Taggin's command center and quarters. All were made of wood. To Huma, raised in a village, it was more like home than the proud keep had ever been. The outpost's builders had planned as well as they could. Huma noted that the structure was close enough to the woods to allow the knights easy access to hunting and to gather fuel for fires, yet was far enough in the plains so that any attempted assault would force the enemy to rush across long stretches of flat open field. Water was provided by a small stream and a deep well. Later, Huma would discover that the knights even grew their own crops in a fortified extension behind the rest of the outpost. Again, Huma could not help but marvel at the differences between knighthood here and back in Solamnia. Taggin ordered Boron to deliver the 2 over to him as soon as they were cleaned and fed. Magus quite bluntly stated that he would talk no more until he was finally allowed some rest. The commander frowned at the mage's arrogant manner, but conceded the necessity. Huma awoke to the sound of men preparing to ride out. He glanced briefly towards Magus, who stirred restlessly, and then turned to the nearest window. The mage peered out. The sun was going down. A number of fully armored knights were riding out of the gate, more than one armed with weighted nets in addition to their normal weaponry. For a patrol, it contained a large number of horsemen. He saw Boron walking past the doorway and signaled to him. The knight waved to him and turned back. Huma began to dress. Boron entered. "Are you better now?" The other knight was talking low. "Oh, much. I've not slept this long in weeks." Huma was silent until he was fully clad. Then he and Boron stepped outside. By this time, the last of the riders had left and the gates were closed. Huma indicated the gates. "Why the heavy patrol? Is there activity by the ogres?" Boron shook his head. "I'm beginning to doubt if there ever will be. No, this problem is more local. We do a little trade with the Qualinesti elves, although they generally tend to stay to themselves, like most of their kind. One of the few who meet with us regularly told us a beast has been lurking about in this general region." The bearded knight smiled. "We wanted to ask them what they were doing so far away from their own lands, but our relationship would not stand the strain. Instead, we thanked them and began to investigate." "Did you see this creature?" "We simply call him the Beast. He's crafty, perhaps an ogre scout even. 3 times he's given us the slip. Tonight, though, they think they can hunt him down to his lair. With any luck, the patrol will take him alive." "For what purpose?" "Well, if he's a spy, he might have information. If he's some sort of animal, Taggin still wants to see him. The Qualinesti are concerned about his presence. The commander wants to see why." Lord Taggin was finishing up his daily routine when Boron brought Huma to speak to him. The elderly knight greeted his visitor amicably. Protocol was unimportant out here, but he seemed nervous. "You have no idea how it stands at present." Huma shook his head. "None. The hope was to regroup. That's all I know." "I see." Taggin stared at him with penetrating eyes. After several moments, the elder knight said, "Well, nothing we can do. It will be best to break the news to the men first thing in the morning, Boron." Boron, who had been standing quietly through the entire talk, did not hesitate. "I'll do it, Lord Taggin." "Fine." The commander cleared off everything from the table he used for his work. "You are excused, lad." Huma turned to Boron, as Boron did, but Taggin immediately stopped him. "Not you, Knight Huma. I still have a few things to ask you. Be seated, please." Nothing was said until Boron had departed. Huma felt uncomfortable alone in the presence of Taggin, but was disciplined enough not to show it. Taggin tapped his fingers on the table. After evidently gathering his thoughts, he spoke. "What is the purpose of your travels?" "My lord?" The nervousness of the senior knight had vanished. His voice and stare were both steady. "Don't hedge, Huma. This is not Vingard. I will not hold you to anything you say. This is between us. I like to think that I'm a good enough judge of character, and I trust you despite the company that you keep." Thank you, my lord." Taggin smiled ruefully at the politeness. "I'm already well aware of my status and especially of my age. Please call me Taggin. Now then, what is your purpose for coming here? I can think of 100 different routes that would have taken you back to Vingard long before now. Why head south? Is it the mage? Despite his less than savory attitude, I gather the two of you are close." "We grew up together." Huma was hesitant about expanding on his friendship with Magius any more than necessary. "Did you? Unusual combination. Still, a man is more than symbols or robes, be they white, red, or even black." "He is not evil, Taggin." The outpost commander smiled slightly. "I did not say he was." Huma began to break down in the presence of understanding. "He fears for his life, but he also thinks to end this war." "Which was his first priority?" Huma tensed. I would have to say his life is more important to him." "Understandable, providing, of course, it is not to the detriment of the world." And Huma had no answer for that. Lord Taggin stood up and paced round the room. "Why have you decided to join him on this, shall we say, quest, for want of a better word? Is it merely out of friendship?" "Yes. No. Both?" The elder knight raised an eyebrow. "Both?" To explain his answer, Huma first had to tell Taggin of the test and how it had affected Magius. The Knight of the Rose listened patiently as Huma told him about Magius's premonition about his own death. Taggin's expression changed a little. "You've been quite honest with me," the commander said when Huma was finished. "I'd like to digest it, and then speak to you again come tomorrow." Now that it was over, Huma was sweating. "Yes, my lord. Thank you." Taggin sat down in his chair. "I've lived a long life, Huma. I've seen more than you think. I want you to consider that tonight." Dismissed. Huma saluted and left. Once outside, he exhaled sharply, and he found Boron waiting for him. "You've not eaten for some time," the bearded knight finally said. "Would you like some nourishment?" Huma smiled thankfully. "I could use some food. Magius might as well." "He can fend for himself. He's a magic user." The comment cut deep. Huma glanced back at the knight's quarters. At last he replied, "He's probably still asleep. When he's hungry, he'll awaken." "Fine." Boron led him away, and Huma did not resist. Night grew aged and finally passed away. Magius remained asleep. Huma decided that the mage must have been purposefully building his strength. Magius might have been dead, judging by the way he appeared, all pale and nearly as stiff as a corpse. But Huma checked his pulse, and discovered nothing wrong. As the first hour of day passed, the sentry gave a shout, and the patrol was home at last. Men rushed to open the gates, speculation on the success of the hunt rampant. Huma found Boron and joined the rest. Taggin stepped out of his quarters and merely watched. The first man at the gate peered through the spy hole and turned back in excitement. "They've got something!" Immediately, Taggin walked towards them. "Everyone on duty return to his post. By the triumvirate, this is a military establishment, not a circus. You'll see the thing soon enough if it's truly a beast." The gates were opened, and the weary but triumphant party rode in. A number of them appeared wounded, but Boron whispered that all had returned. The beast was not visible, having been wrapped up in weighted nets. Some patches of brown fur were evident, but the nature of the beast was hidden. The creature had been forced into a ball. It snorted and growled. Taggin had the beast dragged to a pen, which had been built days before for just this event. While Huma looked on, several knights took hold of the bound mass and pulled it into the pen. The beast squirmed, and some of its wrapping came loose. The knights hurried out of the pen while the creature continued to try to free itself. The patrol leader came up to Lord Taggin and saluted. "Found it by the gully. Killed a stag recently and was eating it. Senseless by then, but by then we had it surrounded. First men tried to net it, and he pulled them in. Got more men wounded trying to rescue the others. For a moment I thought we were going to have to kill it. Fortunately, we did not have to. It tripped in the tangle of nets, and we had it." The elder knight nodded. "Paladin watched over you. That is obvious. I'm glad no one was killed. That cage should hold it from now." "Best not call it a cage. A prison would be more the proper term, my lord." "Prison?" Beside him, Huma and Boron exchanged glances. "What have we got here?" The beast was still unrecognizable, having succeeded in freeing its limbs, but not in uncovering itself. It was obvious now, though, that some of its howls were actually muffled words. The patrol leader looked overly proud. "A spy from the Dragon Queen, one of her ugly creatures from the north. The war has finally come to us." There was a gleam in the knight's eyes that Huma, at least, found disturbing. Taggin stepped closer to the prison cage. The beast had finally begun to tear away at the nets covering it. "Sargas be damned, I'll tear you all apart!" Huma froze. Boron looked at him, possibly wondering why the sight of the beast so astonished Huma. Having recently come from the north, Huma should have been familiar with such creatures. The beast pulled the last net from its horned head. It turned on its captors, breathing heavily. With blood-chilling fury, it shook the bars of its new prison. "Fools! Cowards! Let me fight one of you! Give me a fair chance! Where is your vaunted honor?" "You have no honor!" From its present angle, the beast could not see Huma. Huma, though, could see the beast quite well. He stared wide-eyed at the furious man-beast and wondered just how he was going to save Kaz from execution. I'm going to run off real quick and grab a drink because water is not cutting. The sleepy baby heard me open the fridge. Fine, you have been well behaved. I will give you a treat because I love you. Good girl. She is a very good girl, most of the time. I don't have anything else. I'm sorry. I love you. You're a good girl. Good girl. There's the pupper. You can go back to bed, baby. It was to Boron that he first confided his secret. You were fortunate that no one else noticed, said the bearded knight. Your mouth fairly hung open when he was brought in. Huma shook his head. I was stunned. The last I'd seen of Kaz, he was riding north, and I was riding south. We had a great number of pursuers following us. I was apparently the main prize, for they followed me. And paid the price, Boron remarked quietly. Huma had told him of that incident, without any embellishment. It had not failed to impress the other knight. I'm amazed that Kaz is here, and has been for at least a couple of days more than I have. He must have turned south almost immediately and just barely missed me. After we separated, I was forced to let loose my horse, in the hope that I might lead the pursuers farther astray. I was on foot for some time after that. Still, he must have been riding hard to have gotten all the way here. He must have lost his horse soon after. Did he know where you were heading? Huma thought long. It seemed to be ages ago. In general enough, at least to bear southwest. Boron stared out a window in the direction of the cage. Kaz was slumped in sullen anger. There are many paths that an expert warrior could use to travel safely. He must have discovered our existence down here as well, and assumed that you would stop here. Perhaps you even assumed that this was your destination. And that made some sense to you, Huma. I did mention wanting to return to the knighthood. He may have assumed that I would go here if I could not make it back to Solamnia. Or, Boron hesitated, or he really is a spy, and this was his intention all along. No, Huma was unsure about much lately, but the Minotaur's loyalty was not an issue. You may have trouble convincing the others of that. A Minotaur is a Minotaur. They will question him, and whether or not he speaks, will probably execute him. For what? He's done nothing but defend himself. Boron grimaced. Haven't you heard what I was saying? He's a Minotaur. You do not need any other reason. Huma paced. I must speak with Taggin. We'll do it soon, then. They will start the questioning today, likely after morning vigils. Will I find Taggin in his quarters now? I think not. Being a Knight of the Rose, he will be at his daily prayers by now. It was only because of the hunt that he delayed at all this morning. Speaking of which, have you eased your mind of late? Huma stopped his pacing and whitened. No, I've not. It would serve me right if Paladin turned his eye from me forever. Boron shook his head. I think Paladin is a little more forgiving than that. Come. Taggin was unable to see Huma after prayers. The commanding knight was conferring with his seconds, and with the patrol leader. Huma knew better than to demand entrance. It would only hurt his chances of convincing them to free Kaz. With the leadership busy, Huma decided to face the Minotaur. It was not right that he pretended not to know the massive Easterner, and Kaz had always treated him with honesty. I hate hiccups. The Minotaur's place of confinement was a cage like those used by traveling shows to contain their exotic animals. A metal cage with bars, a single gate, and grass and straw piled on the floor. Kaz did not pace to and fro. Instead, he was sitting, staring sullenly at the meat and grain mixture his jailers had left him. It was hardly an appetizing dish, and Huma wondered if it tasted as horrible as it looked. The two knights guarded the cage, and they quickly blocked Huma's way. "May I question the prisoner?" "That is for the Lord Commander to do. Any who wish to watch may do so." "May I at least speak to him?" The two knights looked at one another. They were no doubt wondering why one of their number would wish to speak with a Minotaur prisoner. At last, the one who had spoken the first time replied, "Not without Lord Commander's permission." But by this time, Kaz had heard the voices. He was slow in reacting, possibly because he was not sure whose voice he was hearing. Then he suddenly turned and leapt up against the bars. "Huma!" The two sentries started, and the one apparently in charge turned and banged a mailed fist against the bars, far enough away that the Minotaur could not grab it. "Be silent, beast! You'll have your chance to talk when the Inquisition meets." Kaz snorted angrily. "I had thought the knights an honorable band, but I see that honor is something very few of them possess." He raised a long, muscular arm through the bars, his hand open as if in supplication. "Huma! Free me from this cage!" The knights stared at Huma with narrowed eyes. "He seems to know you well. How is that?" "We have met and traveled together. He's not the Dragon Queen's slave. He is his own creature, and he is a friend." "A friend?" The guards looked at Huma in amazement and much disbelief. Other knights were beginning to gather, curious as to what the shouting was all about. The other guard finally spoke. Perhaps, Caleb, we should notify Taggin." "I will not interrupt him now." Caleb, a tall, plump man with a carnivorous look, pointed at Huma. "If I did not know better, I might think you a spy for consorting with mages and minotaurs. As it is, I think you are just a fool. If you want to speak to this creature, ask Taggin. I would lock you up until the Inquisition if I had my way." There were murmurs of agreement, and Huma was startled. He had gone from favored visitor to seeming outcast in the space of a few seconds. "What is going on here?" Everyone, even Kaz, froze at the sound of that voice. It was Lord Taggin, clad in his formal dress armor. At least 20 years had slipped from his face. He was now the very image of authority. "You men have become a rabble of late. I can see that I am going to have to make some changes." Taggin turned to Huma. "I'm told you have some knowledge of this Minotaur." Behind the commander, Boron looked down. "We will begin the questioning in half an hour. I expect you to be present and to have your facts prepared. Understood?" "Yes, my lord." Taggin turned to the sentries. "As for you, there are tenets of the knighthood that you seem to be failing. I expect both of you to learn from this incident." The Knight of the Rose did not wait for them to answer. Instead, he walked past them and up to the cage. Kaz glared down at him, and Taggin seemed unimpressed. "Know this, Minotaur. The basics of the knighthood stay the same. Your hearing will be impartial. You will be given every chance to prove yourself, and to prove what this knight says of you. I will promise that." Kaz did not reply, save for the mere ghost of a nod. Taggin spun round and headed towards his quarters. "You never cease to amaze me with your ability to become the center of attention, Huma." Huma and Boron looked up as they entered the knight's living quarters. Magus, in full splendor, his robes of red, stared at them from across the room. Again, Huma wondered at the change. Had Magus really returned to the Order of Lunatari, or was this merely another of his whims? "The mage returns to the land of the living," Boron remarked dryly. The mage stirred. "Really, Huma, the only thing more foolish than you parading around in sheets of metal is the company you tend to keep, myself excluded, of course." "If you have nothing worthwhile to say, Magus, then don't say anything." Huma surprised himself by his comment. Magus ignored the barb. "I see the Minotaur has succeeded in getting into trouble. We really do not have time for this. Had I not required the rest, we could have been gone by last night." Boron smiled nastily. "You go nowhere without Lord Taggin's permission." Won't I? Not with me, Magius. Not unless Kaz is freed, Huma added. The mage sighed. Very well. I do hope this won't take long. I know how long and boring inquisitions can be. Huma, is this filth really your friend? Boron interjected. If you can believe it, I still hope to find the old Magus underneath there. And for once, the magic user had no retort. He merely looked at Huma and then studied something interesting on his staff. Are you coming with me, Magus? His childhood friend looked up. To an inquisition? Hardly. They might decide to put me on trial. I shall await the outcome here. Here. Huma let out a sigh, although whether it was from relief or worry he could not say. Unlike the formal inquisitions of Vingard Keep, the sessions at the outpost were quick, straightforward, and to the point. Kaz was questioned about his whereabouts for the last half-year. His crime against his former masters and his subsequent meeting with Huma were gone in over a minute. were gone over in minute detail, as Lord Taggin looked for some slip that might prove the Minotaur untrustworthy. In the course of the questioning, many facets of the Minotaur's past came out. He had been one in a long line of champions in his clan. He had even been given the name of one of his more remote ancestors, a powerful fighter who had been ruler of the race for 23 years before finally falling to defeat. Kaz, though, had grown up in a time in which no true ruler commanded the Minotaurs. As Huma had learned, those who controlled the race now were, in turn, puppets of the Dragon Queen's commanders. Each Minotaur, male or female, was conscripted into the swelling ranks of the Dark Queen's armies upon reaching fighting age. There were never enough of the race in any one unit to create an atmosphere of rebellion. Kaz's people were severely punished for even the smallest of infractions. The tall warrior admitted that he had done his share of fighting. It was part of his nature. Yet he had slowly become sickened by the senseless slaughter around him. There was no honor in much of what he was forced to do. The ogres cared not whether they were facing an army or a village. All who stood in their path were to be destroyed. Kaz then went into detail about the final incident when he had come across the butchering ogre captain. For a brief time, the knights in attendance were solely on his side. The news of the collapse of the Solamnic lines and the chaos that followed brought renewed anger from those knights. From there, Kaz described the attack on the citadel of Magius and the flight that had resulted in the separation of Huma and Kaz. Perhaps the highlight of the questioning occurred when Kaz described Huma's brief but bloody encounter with the warlord. The tide of feeling again flowed towards Huma. Those who had frowned on his odd friendship began to look at him with renewed respect. After Kaz, Huma spoke. He did not plead with the knights, only spoke to them of the Minotaur's acts of bravery and justice. He also pointed out that honor was just as important to Kaz as it was to the knighthood. Lord Taggin looked extremely tired when all was said and done. Standing and facing the Minotaur, who was bound and under guard, Lord Taggin took a deep breath and said, The Minotaur Kaz has cooperated in all ways. He has given us a good look into the workings of the Dragon Queen's forces, and his words are confirmed by Huma, Knight of the Crown. By rights, he has earned an honorable death. Kaz snorted angrily and began to struggle with his bonds. Huma started to rise, but Boron pushed him back down. Taggin continued. There is, however, another possibility. Paladin is a god of justice and wisdom. To execute the Minotaur would be as great a travesty as we could commit. Therefore, I am placing him in the capable custody of Knight Huma, whom I believe we can trust to keep him under control. A cheer rose. Opinions of Huma had swayed so much again that he was now nearly as great a hero to his fellows as he had once been to the Argothians. Remove the Minotaur's bounds. Knight Caleb reluctantly obeyed. Kaz gave him a toothy grin as the knight removed the last of the bonds. An instant later, the Minotaur came bursting through the crowd. Kaz took hold of his former companion and lifted him high with a cry of pleasure. I thought I would never see you again, oh friend Huma. You should know that out of respect to you, I held my temper while I searched. Glad I am that I chose to turn south immediately. It did occur to me that you might have gone north in search of me. Huma flushed. I could only hope that you were. I could only hope that you were safe. My path led me southward, and even when I did not wish it to. Magius, Kaz misunderstood. Yes, I saw that dragon-spawned mage friend of yours peering at me. He seemed quite willing to sacrifice me for the sake of expediency. I was so enraged by his satisfied expression that I began contemplating a suicidal escape attempt. The Minotaur bellowed in laughter, although Huma could not see why. Taggin cleared his throat. Huma quickly steered the Minotaur over towards him. Lord Taggin, Knight of the Rose, I present to you Kaz, Minotaur, of a lineage that has produced more than a dozen champions of my race. Blood did not count as much in the land of the Minotaurs as it did among the aristocratically minded knights of Salamia, but a lineage that produced champions was highly admired by other Minotaurs. To the knights, it was as if Kaz had called himself a noble of his people. Taggin greeted the Minotaur and then turned serious. When the others are gone, we will speak. I've summoned the mage, too. It did not take long for the room to empty. One look from the commander sent Boron out the doorway. Kaz looked puzzled, but Lord Taggin refused to talk until Magius had arrived. With obvious reluctance, the mage entered. Kaz stiffened, and his eyes reddened in anger. Huma feared an attack, but Kaz stood his ground. Magius pretended that the massive figure was not even there. I have come as you requested, Lord Taggin. How very decent of you. The elder knight was no more willing to hide his animosity towards the mage than Boron had been. I've decided to allow you to continue your journey, and will even provide an escort. How very decent of you, Lord Taggin. But we do not need an escort. Huma and I can take it on our own. But you won't be alone, wolf spawn, Kaz hissed. I will be going with you, whether an escort does or not. Taggin held up a hand for silence. You have no choice. I will send an escort anyway. It is not a politeness. It is a requirement if you intend going on with this quest. Magius glared openly at Huma. Would that you had taken an oath of silence. Your tongue flaps well, it seems. Huma bristled, but would not satisfy his companion with a childish retort. The outpost commander stepped up to Magius until less than a handspan separated their faces. You will be leaving tomorrow morning at dawn. No sooner, no later. If you think to sneak away, do not bother. We will find you, and then I will lock you up. We can hold a magic user. Trust me on that. It was quite satisfying to Huma when Magius was the first to back down. Very well. Since we apparently have no choice, you do not. Turning to Huma, Magius pointed to the Minotaur and asked, That must go with us as well? Absolutely, Kaz added to Huma's answer. Absolutely, Kaz added to Huma's answer with a menacing snarl that revealed teeth. The morning then, Magius turned back to Lord Taggin. Is that all? No. Do I understand that this is all based on a dream? The mage smiled, sadly it seemed. The test was no dream. A nightmare is more appropriate. A nightmare I hope to change. Taggin stared into his eyes. You have not told him everything, have you, Magius? Huma's eyes widened, then grew wider still as the magic user continued to delay his response. Magius glanced at the others, then abruptly turned towards the door. No. When the time is right, I will. They watched him depart. Watch him, Huma, Taggin finally whispered. Not just for your sakes, but for his. The younger knight could only nod. Again, he wondered how he could ever still believe in mages. A knight stood waiting at the top of the tallest peak. His visor was down, so it was impossible to identify him. He wore the sign of the Knights of the Rose, and in his left hand he held a magnificent sword. He appeared to offer the weapon to Huma. Huma crawled over crag and ravine. He lost his grip more than a dozen times. but each time he regained it before he had a chance to fall. Although Huma was near the top, the other knight did not help him. Instead, the strange figure continued to hold out the sword. Huma stumbled over and accepted the proffered weapon. It was a beautiful sword, an antique. Huma sliced the air 3 times. The other knight looked on. The young knight thanked him for the weapon and asked him his name. The visored knight did not speak. Suddenly, growing angry, Huma reached forward and lifted the visor. He was never sure what he saw, for something howled, and Huma bolted upright in his cot, and the dream shattered. Taggin was there to see that nothing went awry. He paid particular attention to the activities of Magius, but the spellcaster was behaving himself this morning. The escort arrived. 10 men had volunteered, and Huma was relieved that Boron was one of them. When the entire troop was ready and mounted, Boron signaled for the gates to be opened. As they rode out, each man, with the exception of Magius and Kaz, saluted the outpost commander. Lord Taggin had said nothing to Huma that morning, but he returned the salute with a slight wave of assurance. Their journey was to take them through open field for the entire journey, giving them an ever-expanding view of the chain of mountains. They were at least several days' journey from their goal. Huma wondered which peak Magius was seeking and what he expected to find. The mage was being very quiet. As a matter of fact, his eyes had been fixed on the mountain peaks from the moment that they had left this outpost. Magius stared at the great rocky leviathans as if his life depended on them, which it quite possibly did. Had Huma looked back at that moment, he might have noticed the swift form that darted into and out of whatever shelter it could find. It did not care for the day, which was harmful to its kind. Not that it really thought of itself as anything other than an extension of its master. Nevertheless, it had made the long journey to act as the eyes and ears of the one who held its existence in its hands. For him, it would suffer the burning pain of daylight that seared even through the ever-present cloud cover. Wherever the knight and mage traveled, the dread wolf would follow. So that is 2 more chapters. I feel like I was kind of fudging the lines a little bit more than usual, but, such a thing is life. And we are on page 170. Out of 379. So we have little over 200 pages left. Little under half. We're a little under halfway through. Ugh. Gosh darn hiccups. I hate them so much. So, anyway. Get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. So remember, be brave and do your best, okay? Sleep well.